Witnesses please to turn off their mobile phones or to switch them to flight mode, because as we know mobile phones interfere with the sound system and they make it difficult for the parliamentary reporters to report the meeting, and also television coverage and web streaming will be adversely affected. So we have reached number 6 on our agenda, which is in relation to engagement with stakeholders on the delivery of services for students with Down syndrome. And the purpose of this part of the meeting is to have an engagement in relation to the delivery of services for students with Down syndrome. And on behalf of the committee, I wish to welcome Fiona Brady, who is the National Education Officer with Down Syndrome Ireland, Moira Layden, the Assistant General Secretary of the Association of Secondary Teachers Ireland, who has been before us a number of times, Colm Kelly from the TUI, Maeve McCafferty from the INTO, and Eddie Ward, Principal Officer with the Department of Education and Skills, who has been with us before also. And just to say that we as a committee are very eager to examine the challenges and the opportunities for students with Down syndrome as they access educational services. It's something we've spoken about a lot in the past, and we know from research that has been done that the vast majority of children with Down syndrome enrol in their local primary mainstream school and are progressing to mainstream post-primary education once they have the opportunity to do that, if there is a place locally, and quite often we're finding that they're not. But just to say that students and teachers all need our support, because the success of inclusive education in Ireland is absolutely testament to the professionalism and commitment of teachers and school staff for students with special educational needs. Obviously the SNAs play a very important role also. And I suppose, one of the main reasons really for having this meeting was to discuss the individualised education plans for students with Down syndrome, and also about the inequality of access to an extended school year, which is the July provision for students with Down syndrome. So we're looking forward to examining all of those issues in key detail. The format of the meeting is that I will invite you all to make a brief opening statement of maximum 3 minutes, which will be followed by an engagement with members of the committee. And what we'll do when we get to the members, we'll take a series of questions or comments from members before we go back to you. And we're joined by Senator John Dolan, who isn't a member of the committee but has a very, very keen interest in the whole area. So once we have had the opportunity to hear questions and observations from the members of the committee, we will certainly be going to Senator Dolan also. Before we begin, I wish to draw your attention to the fact that by virtue of Section 17(2)(l) of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of your evidence to this committee. However, if you are directed by myself as Chair to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter, and you continue to do so, you are entitled thereafter only to a qualified privilege in respect of your evidence, and you are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that, where possible, you should not criticise nor make charges against any person, persons or entity by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. And I also wish to advise you that any opening statements that you have made to the committee will be published on the committee website after this meeting. And I also obviously want to remind members of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the Houses or an official, either by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. So without any further ado, I would like to call on Fiona Brady to make her opening statement on behalf of Down Syndrome Ireland.
Okay, thank you very much, Madam Chairman. Students with Down syndrome have the right to be educated in their local mainstream school under the UNCRPD But currently schools are encouraged, rather than obligated, to provide an individual education plan. The answer to a recent parliamentary question about the implementation and resourcing of the EPSN Act makes it very clear that the Minister accepts that the funds needed for its full implementation have not, and indeed will not, be provided. The current DES position seems to be that schools are encouraged to implement large parts of the EPSN Act without having the necessary resources. Down Syndrome Ireland has long campaigned for the EPSN Act to be fully enacted, so that the rights of students with additional educational needs will be enshrined in law, rather than depending on encouragement from the Department of Education and Skills and indeed the goodwill of schools and teachers. However, in DSI we cannot stand by while teacher unions advise members to take action which discriminates against students who have intellectual disabilities. We believe that students with Down syndrome will suffer and will struggle to be successful in education if they do not have a structured IEP. Planning for this needs to be coordinated by teachers who are given the training, the resources and indeed non-contact time necessary to carry this duty out effectively. So therefore, in this regard, we need an acknowledgement that fully inclusive education is a right, not a privilege, and a plan is to be initiated immediately to ensure that teachers are resourced and trained to meet the needs of all their students. In relation to July provision, it provides funding for an extended school year for children with severe to profound GLD or children with ASD. We recognise, of course, that there are faults with the July provision scheme. In its current form, it's discriminatory because it excludes most students with Down syndrome. Like ASD, students with Down syndrome have complex educational needs and they are likely to regress educationally unless they have some level of support in place for a portion of the summer break. We are told many, many times by teachers and parents alike that the long summer break is detrimental to the learning and retention of skills. We've questioned the DES and various members on this matter, and the response we receive constantly is that the provision scheme is under review and there will be no revisions happening until the review is complete. Meantime, students continue to progress through the education system without the supports they need in order to reach their potential. It's not acceptable to Down Syndrome Ireland that such discrimination continues while a review of the scheme is carried out. Our experience with previous DES reviews is that they take a considerable length of time to lead to action, sometimes many years. We are calling for an interim agreement to be put in place to meet the needs of our members, with July provision to be made immediately available to all students with Down syndrome, regardless of their intellectual ability. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I'm now going to move to Moira, please, representing the ASTI.
Thank you. It's nice to be back here again. A really serious issue. I think Fidelma started us off all on the right note when she used the word right to education to preface her contribution. I think that's absolutely the core element of all of our engagement with students with special and additional needs. So I just want to make, in my 3 minutes, I just want to make some broad observations and come specifically to the topics we were asked to address, namely planning and the July provision. So, as I said, the human right, and I was just saying to Fidelma, I was on her website this morning, and you made the very pertinent point that we were one of the last countries to ratify the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disability. So I do think we have considerable ground to make up. At the same time, I think we can all justifiably say that inclusion is one of the success stories in Irish education. Over 90% of young people with special educational needs are in mainstream schools. I mean, that is absolutely phenomenal, and I think is a testament both teachers and to parents and to legislators and indeed to the ministers over the decades. I think one of the serious, and Senator Dolan here would be very aware of this, I think one of the challenging aspects of special educational needs in our system is that the definition in our legislation means that there is a very high prevalence of between 20 and 25% of the estimated prevalence. So this is very much a systemic challenge. How does a school system provide additional resources and supports for a considerable, almost a quarter of the student cohort at any point in time? So I'll leave that for a moment. And my second point then is that the system change change to support this inclusion process has been significant. Most recently, we've had the school admissions legislation, which is really, I think, going to make sure that every school, every sector of education is playing by the same rules. We've had curriculum change, Level 1 and Level 2 programmes, which are a huge development on what we've had in the past. And I think what's really significant is that with departmental recommendations and system research, we have seen that the withdrawal method of taking students out of mainstream classes is not the best way forward. The best way forward is for students to be in the mainstream with the additional supports, with teacher differentiation, etc. So why are we here? Well, we're here because we've got a problem. As Fidelma has said, the teacher unions, the second level teacher unions, have reached almost a critical point in terms of what our members are telling us in terms of our capacity to implement the new model, whereby classroom teachers are required to engage in extensive planning for individual pupils. I must put it on record, there is absolutely no objection to planning for students with special educational needs. I mean, the students have a right to education. Schools and teachers must make sure that right is vindicated. However, what the teacher unions at second level are saying is that we simply do not have the training, we don't have the dedicated time, and at the moment we don't have the clear enough guidance. One of the challenging issues for second level schools, which are very complex institutions, is the fact that there is not dedicated coordination time to coordinate not just the liaison between teachers around planning, but more significantly, the liaison between teachers and the external agencies, particularly for students who have more profound needs. So we're talking about the classics of investment in education. Teachers need time, which means less teaching time, more time for planning. That requires investment. We need training, and we also need, I think, better communication strategies from the department to the school system. As I said, the coordination time is very problematic for us, because in a circular issued by the department, it says that in order to make sure that resources are used for teaching purposes, coordination time should be kept to a minimum, and we find that particularly challenging because in complex institutions such as schools with 700 to 1,000 pupils, you need planning, dedicated planning time. I'm going to stop there. I've possibly gone over time, but obviously we can take questions on specific issues.
Okay,
thank you.
Thank you, Maura. And now I move to Colin Kelly from the TUI.
Thanks, Chair. The TUI represents teachers and lecturers in excess of 17,000 employed by education and training boards, voluntary secondary schools and community and comprehensive schools, as well as the Institutes of Technology. We also have a small number of members teaching in special schools. The TUI welcomes this opportunity to make a submission to the committee in relation to the delivery of services for students with Down syndrome. Some 0.18% of all children are diagnosed with Down syndrome. This equates to approximately 1,600 students across primary and post-primary. We're not aware of any specific data for the post-primary sector alone. Data clearly shows that students with special educational needs, such as those with Down syndrome, are far more likely to attend DTB and C&C schools than voluntary secondary schools. The TUI believes that all students should be able to access mainstream schools unless the needs of the student are so serious that they couldn't cope in a mainstream school. For this to happen, it must be supported by the resourcing of both the schools and the relevant support services. Staff that pursue additional qualifications in the area of special educational needs must be recompensed for that study, and it's important to note that the role of the teacher is to support the education of the child, whilst the SNA, if applicable, can cater to the care needs of the child. All schools should accept students with special educational needs. In relation to individual education plans, a commitment to implementing the EPSN Act 2004 is essential if provision for students with special educational needs is to be adequately and appropriately addressed. However, full implementation will only be possible when sufficient resources are allocated. Over 10 years ago, our union, the TUI, emphasised that schools were not sufficiently resourced to implement individual education plans for SEN students. The TUI has been calling for the full implementation and resourcing of the EPSN Act for almost 15 years. We've reiterated that call 4 times in the last year alone. However, we have been told by successive governments that the funding is not available to enact the remaining provisions of the legislation. In the absence of appropriate resourcing, TUI members cannot be required to implement IEPs. To do so would create the false impression for parents and guardians that a school has a developed capacity to deliver this level of service as promised in the EPSN Act. It is the moral and legal responsibility of the state, acting through the DES, to provide the necessary resources. The TUI cannot and will not countenance an opportunistic transfer of that responsibility or of any associated culpability from the state to our teachers. We have informed members that our objection to a medicalised, administratively heavy IEP process does not apply to normal, professionally appropriate and sustainable classroom planning by teachers for differentiated teaching and learning that takes due account of the strengths and needs of the students that they serve and of the context in which they teach. In terms of our recommendations to the committee, we would like to make the following recommendations. Recent changes in guidance provisions, Circular 12 of 17, and middle management posts in Circular 3 of 18, are not enough to fully support students with special educational needs. A much larger move in terms of restoration of both is also needed. Teachers must be able to access continuous professional development in order to best support students with special educational needs. Schools should be able to access support from the significantly under pressure support services. Education at all levels should be available to every child, the deciding factor being what is in the best interest of the child. The Department of Education and Skills must make clear once and for all if it ever...
Can you just finish up?
Final sentence. If it ever intends to fully implement and resource the EPSN Act. If it cannot implement the EPSN Act as originally intended, then will the DES join with us in examining a more appropriate method of supporting students with Down syndrome so that they may achieve a better outcome for the students?
Okay, thank you, Colin. And now I move to Maeve McCafferty from the INTO.
The INTO thanks the Oireachtas for the opportunity to be here as representatives of over 35,000 primary teachers in the south of Ireland. Currently, children with Down syndrome attend both special and mainstream schools. Their educational placement is determined by their needs and by the choice of their parents. The learning ability of children with Down syndrome varies from severe and profound general learning disability to mild general learning disabilities. Therefore, their learning needs also vary. Children with Down syndrome who attend special schools are in classes of approximately 6 to 8 pupils. Children with Down syndrome in mainstream schools could be in classes of 30 pupils or more and usually receive additional support from the special education team. The INTO is of the view that educational provision for children with Down syndrome should be on a continuum depending on their individual needs and unique needs. The greatest lacuna in support for children with special educational needs, including children with Down syndrome, is the lack of therapy supports. Children with special educational needs often require speech and language therapy, occupational therapy, or other support such as behavioural therapy and counselling. The INTO welcomes the piloting of a model for providing school-based therapy services. Not all children with Down syndrome require additional therapies, but when they do, these supports should be available regardless of whether the child attends special or mainstream schools. The SESS, now part of the NCSE, provide professional development opportunities for teachers in the area of special ed. While the SESS provide very valuable and high-quality professional development, it is insufficient. In addition to courses and seminars, there is a need to develop in-school sustained support. All newly qualified teachers have studied special and inclusive education as part of their initial teacher education courses, but it is important that teachers have opportunities throughout their careers to continue their learning and development in this area. The certificate and diploma courses provided by colleges of education are highly regarded, but are only accessible to teachers in special ed posts. Given the policy focus on inclusion, all teachers, both mainstream and special ed, should have access to the certificate and diploma level courses in special ed. The July Provision Scheme is very valuable educationally for children with severe and profound general learning disabilities and for children with ASD, as it enables continuity and allows for as little interruption as possible in the education of children. However, the fact that July provision is confined to children with severe and profound general learning difficulties and children with ASD is seen as excluding other children with learning disabilities, such as children with Down syndrome. The NCSE, in its policy advice, recommended that July provision be reviewed. There are many practical issues to be addressed regarding July provision, such as who should be entitled to additional educational provision during the summer, what the nature of summer educational programmes supported by the state should be, and practical arrangements pertaining to curriculum, employment and location. The INTO welcomes the proposal to review July provision, both its operation and its purpose. Children with Down syndrome thrive in schools, whether special or mainstream, where teachers have been afforded the opportunity to avail of appropriate professional development in relation to the education of children with Down syndrome and where suitable supports have been put in place. Thank you.
Thank you, Maeve. And finally, we have Eddie Ward, Principal Officer with the Department of Education and Skills.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks to the committee for the invitation to present before you today. Government policy on supporting children with special educational needs aims to ensure that all children with special needs, including children with Down syndrome, have access to an education appropriate to their needs. Policies to provide for an inclusive education and to ensure maximum possible integration of children with special needs into ordinary mainstream schools. Where pupils require more targeted intervention, special class and special school placements are provided. Very significant levels of financial investment and financial provision have been made to ensure that all children with special education needs now access education. The Department of Education currently spends about £1.75 billion each year and almost 20% of its budget on special needs. And the main supports funded by the Department include there's 13,400 special education teachers in mainstream schools to provide additional support for pupils with special needs. There are 15,000 special needs assistants, 125 special schools and over 1,450 special classes in mainstream schools. There is a funding scheme for assistive technology, there is special transport arrangements, and also there is a significant time put into developing new curriculum and innovation in that regard, professional development for teachers and training, and support for schools, July provision. The Department's National Educational Psychological Service also provides support and advice for schools. In addition to that, the Department has established the National Council of Special Education to advise it on policy on special education needs and to develop and deliver a variety of services to support children and their families. For example, schools and teachers can apply to the NCSE for help from its support service that would include specialist support and guidance in all areas of special education, including Down syndrome. This support can take the form of workshops tailored to the needs of the school and the teachers in particular communities and in-school supports. There were about 2,500 such applications in the 2017-18 school year. The NCSE would also develop courses, and there is one particular one dedicated to Down syndrome. The NCSE has also collaborated with Down Syndrome Ireland in relation to the development of a number of differentiated lessons that are available to teachers and to parents. As part of its policy-making remit, the NCSE develops policy papers from time to time and advises the Department, and in doing so it conducts quite a lot of consultation with the various stakeholders, and the Down Syndrome Ireland would be one of the key people that they would consult. For example, in the area of the policy paper on the provision for children with autism spectrum disorder, the 2018 Comprehensive Review on the Special Needs Assistance Scheme, and more recently on the policy that's currently being developed in relation to special schools and classes. The Department's aim is to improve education outcomes for all children, including those with special education needs. Significant investment has been made, as I said, and I think I would agree that inclusion in our schools has been one of the major successes in recent times. As policy evolves and services develop, the Department, the NCSE, will consult and work with all stakeholders, including Down Syndrome Ireland, to achieve the best possible education outcomes for children, for all children. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Eddie. Now I'm going to go to the members, and Deputy Martin, I'm going to call on you first.
Thank you very much for your presentations. I just have a couple of questions. Mostly to the department. So the department describes education planning to plan and record the support schools provide for pupils with special education needs to be both beneficial for schools and children and best practice. But we have the EPSN Act 2004, which hasn't been fully enacted, so it's not yet a statutory requirement for schools to have the IEPs in place. So can you tell me how many students with special education needs do not currently have individual learning plans? And we know that we need structured IEPs in place is essential for students with Down syndrome. That planning is essential, but it must be, and everyone seems to be in agreement, the stakeholders, it must be coordinated by a teacher who are given the time, and it's non-contact time. They must be given the training, and critically, they must be given the resources. So could you tell me, how does the department plan to ensure this happens? Remember now, we are talking about a fundamental human right. So how is that going to happen? Could you tell me when, if ever, does the department intend to fully implement and resource the EPSN Act? Because if you don't do that, it's not worth the paper it's written on. And I think it's appalling that we're here in 2019 and it hasn't been fully implemented or resourced. The NCSE has recommended that an equitable day activity scheme be developed for all students with complex special educational needs, and I understand an implementation group has been convened. What is the time frame for that review, and what are the possible solutions in the interim? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Deputy. Deputy Funchion.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, I welcome the opportunity to have all the main stakeholders here present. And I want to start off by saying it's always my instinct to support trade unions. I worked in a trade union. I come from a very strong trade union household. But I have to say that I do not agree with the union's position in terms of withdrawing the IEPs. I totally support your call for extra training, for extra resources, for anything that's needed. I'd always be an advocate for workers' rights. But I think this is singling out a group of vulnerable students who already probably had to battle through lots of aspects of their lives, and their parents had to battle on their behalf. And I don't think it's fair, and I think if you were to take some sort of action, I fully support that, but I don't think it should single out those students. I think it should be the same for every student. For example, if you were saying to me that you were looking to go on strike in relation to this, or looking to have some sort of a work to rule or some sort of industrial action, I would be more supportive of that than just withdrawing it completely. It's obviously not a perfect system. You are the ones that are dealing with it on a daily basis, and you know an awful lot about it. There obviously does need to be a lot more investment and a lot more work done on it, and that's the question I would put to the department. But I just don't think that it was the right thing to do, and I just wanted to have that on record because I feel very strongly about it. To the department, I would say, I mean, you're currently standing over a situation where these children are being completely left behind. I mean, one of the biggest queries we deal with, whether it's children with Down syndrome or children with additional needs, is the constant battle that they face in their lives to get anything that they're supposed to be entitled to. I mean, you can't talk about education being a right and being inclusive if children are being completely left behind, and that's what's currently happening. So I don't think it's good enough that this needs to be addressed right now with a time frame given as to exactly when it's going to be sorted out, and not something that's going to drag on and we're sitting here in 2 years' time talking about the same thing and all those children have been failed. It's consistent. We're constantly talking in here about different systems where children are falling through the cracks, and we just cannot allow it to keep happening. I would stress that to the department, and it's I was going to ask about the EPSN Act, but Deputy Martin has asked about that in terms of the time frame, in terms of what's happening with the full implementation of that. We asked a question about it last week, and one of the parts of the answers was the Department of Education and Skills, the level of investment required could be significantly greater than that envisaged in the NCSE report. So is the department saying it's just going to cost too much money and they're just not going to be bothered about it? I could at least be honest about that if that is the answer. But I think it's, we really do need to see action being taken on all of these things.
Okay, thank you, Deputy Funchion. Senator Maria Byrne.
Thanks very much indeed, Caoirleach, and thank you to the 5 contributors to their speeches. I suppose the July provision is something that we're all concerned about, and this really, I suppose, is where we're coming from in relation to how you were here today. I know a friend of mine, their son has Down syndrome, and certainly he's a very intelligent child and has an awful lot to contribute, but I know that they find it very frustrating that they don't qualify for the July provision, but yet a child down the road with autism does. So I suppose mainly to the department, but maybe to all contributors, I mean, is there any other alternatives that you'd be coming up with that, or certainly, I suppose the question is, why do they not qualify? I think it's so important because they have so much to learn from it, and there's an awful lot of skills taught during those couple of weeks, and certainly I know during the summertime that children with Down syndrome can find it a very long, whereas if they're coming to training, if it's baking or whatever, I mean, they're learning a skill set, and I mean, they really enjoy learning the life skills, I suppose, during that time. And I know the TUI, you were talking about alternative proposals. What are the alternative proposals? So they're my questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Senator. I'm going to go back to the panel now, but also just to make the point that commencement of the provisions of the ESPN Act can only be done by the Minister, not by officials within the department. So just to make that clear, that it is a political decision that has to be done, as opposed to the department, because they can only follow the policy from the Minister. But I'm happy to go back now to our witnesses here, if you wish to. Colin?
Thanks, Chair.
Yeah.
Just, I suppose, to clarify an issue raised by Deputy Funchion, it's not that the TUI is taking any action. In fact, the TUI has not taken action on the issue of IEP since 2004. The TUI has very much not taken action in that they haven't implemented it, because the legislature haven't implemented the relevant sections of the EPSN Act. So our advice to our members, and it is that it's advice, it's not a directive, it's not an action, has been the same since 2004, which is that until government and the government through the department properly resource the style of individual education plans that are set out in the EPSN Act, sections 8 and 9 of the EPSN Act, our members are not properly resourced to implement that particular style of planning. Our members, however, have and consistently do plan differentiated strategies for students with special educational needs in their classes. They are professionals, and they would not renege on their responsibilities in that regard. So it's just to make it absolutely clear that there is no action being taken here. We are simply continuing to teach, but to teach within the strictures that we have without having the resources to implement what's in the EPSN Act.
Okay, thank you, Maeve?
Yeah, just to follow up on that, just to be clear and put on the record that at primary levels, teachers do plan for special ed, including completing IEPs in consultation with parents where the need arises. It doesn't happen in all cases. It depends on the level of need, whether it's an IEP, but there's certainly planning for special ed for all special educational needs. And just to say on the July provision, we certainly welcome the review, and we would like to see it broadened as well and the roles clarified further.
Thank you. Mara?
Thank you. Yes. Thank you, Deputy Funchion. I absolutely am listening and hearing what you're saying, and I feel the frustration and possibly anger in your comments, and I think that's very legitimate. I think what has precipitated this issue now is that we've now had a new model of allocation of teachers to schools, which is, as the department has said, is a significant investment by the state. But unfortunately, unlike other initiatives, for example, like the junior cycle or Project Maths, that new model has not been underpinned by a training rollout, and it has not been underpinned by clarity of instruction as to where the roles fall. I have to say on record, and it's only fair to the department did provide some clarification to us some weeks ago on who was expected to do the educational planning and how it might best be coordinated within the school context. But prior to that, there was this sense of, oh my goodness, we now have this new model, we now have a new inspection model which was introduced in January 2019 to see how all of this new model is working. It's going to look at deployment of resources, but more significantly it's going to look at outcomes, learning outcomes for students with special needs. And I think, to be very frank, I think teachers got extremely worried. Oh my goodness, we now have an evaluation model, which is a very serious process. We have this new model in place, but we actually not quite sure how it works, and more significantly, we don't feel we have been trained sufficiently to be able to do the type of complex planning. And we're planning not just in terms of, a sheet of paper. We're talking about a continuum of support model where there is a continual iterative process of review of the students' progress, etc. So I think it's only fair to state that that was the factors behind, the advice which was issued to members. And I think it's really critical that all of the stakeholders sit down now and work out a solution to the very clear-cut problems we've identified. Time, training, coordination, and I would also say, and we must also say this, is that teachers need incentives to engage in this further learning. Most of the training that's provided for special educational needs, because of its complex nature, is at graduate diploma or postgraduate level. That's a very costly exercise to engage in. So we really need to start talking about underpinning this type of complex learning by teachers, by enabling them to access these programmes of learning at little or no cost. So I think there's very practical solutions to the impasse that we're in, but we need to move on it rather quickly. And the word you used, Deputy, is exactly appropriate. We need action. Thank you.
Thank you, Maura, and well said. Fidelma, do you want to comment on any of this?
Just to say that I would be in agreement, obviously, with Deputy Funchion and her statements. I would also like just to point out that, you know, rather than we get totally wrapped up in the EPSN Act, which is a big issue, of course, but we do need to remember that the right to inclusion has been enshrined in the Convention itself, regardless of the EPSN Act being enacted or not. And like the Convention itself does list what the barriers are to inclusion, and they're just as, you know, Deputy Martin has pointed out already, that, you know, they need to have funding. We need to have the correct funding, the correct approaches. There's a list of maybe something like 10 barriers to inclusion, and if these barriers are not taken out of the way, well, not only the Convention won't be enacted, but we're certainly in trouble with the EPSN. Like, inadequate funding mechanisms is one thing that's listed. And obviously, if the incentives are not there for the training to be provided, well, it's not going to be. I was just interested to note that we talked a little bit about the training that's provided for teachers. I suppose in my role, I'm a primary teacher is my background, but I do a lot of training in schools. I'm literally, that's part of my job. I go around primary schools, I go around post-primary schools, actually giving some little bit of training, giving teachers some bit of information, some kind of a foothold, as they do have children with Down syndrome in their mainstream school. And very often that is the only option that is there for schools, because sometimes I know my colleague from the department down there referred to the SESS, maybe courses that's there. But they're as they would say in the country, they're like hen's teeth. You know, you can't get on a course. You try and get somebody to come in to do a little bit of love. There could be a 2-year waiting list. So, you know, you have to just be realistic. We have to look at the idea of, you know, we do need adequate funding, and we have called for a long time, even before my time within Down Syndrome Ireland, we need a rollout of training, and not just continuous professional development where teachers can do this course or do that course or do another course. We need to be looking at initial teacher training. You know, what is going on in training college? And I would like to say that, you know, my own behalf, and I suppose behalf of Down Syndrome Ireland, at no point am I kind of coming down hard on teachers in this. And I would like to certainly make that clear to all the unions. I have found myself that teachers are bending over backwards to work with these children, but in very, very, very difficult situations. And it's impossible to find enough time in the day. I was a teaching principal for many years in a primary school, and it's just impossible. And I can quite say, if I hadn't been given extra time, or if I wasn't given extra time, I don't know where I'd even start to do IEPs. So we're looking at the training time, the non-contact time, the resources to be put in place for, I would call it a national rollout of training for these teachers before we have very, very unrealistic expectations for what they can produce. Thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you, Fidelma. Eddie, I'm going to come back to you for final comment before we go to other members.
Okay. I suppose you want me to speak now?
Yes,
yeah,
please.
Okay. I suppose the first issue maybe I'd like to address is the issue about planning in schools. I suppose since the enactment of the 1998 Act, Education Act, there was an obligation on schools to plan and to ensure that there was an appropriate education being provided to all the children attending the school. And in that way, you know, teachers would know their children's needs and provide for them in accordance with the resources available to them. In the 2004 EPSN Act, reference has been made to the individual education plan that was provided for. That section of that Act wasn't commenced at the time. It reflected, I suppose, the thinking of the time that students' needs were assessed and then resources were allocated to the child on the basis of the assessment. And I suppose it's fair to say that policy has evolved and practice has changed considerably since then. And I suppose I need to emphasise again the level of investment that has taken place in schools in terms of the additional resources and additional teachers and SNAs that have gone into schools since that time, but particularly since 2011. The number of teachers, special education teachers, has increased by over 40%. Likewise, the number of SNAs in the system has increased. Teacher resources, and has been referenced already in terms of the way we allocate teaching resources to schools. A new model has now meant that these resources, additional teachers, are preloaded into the system in accordance with the school profile, and then it's left to the school to actually use their professional judgment and the guidance and support that are available to them in allocating those resources to those children who are most in need. And this, in terms of the research that supported this model and done by the NCSE, this was seen to be by far the best way of doing it. You put the resources into the schools, and then so that when the child comes to the school, the resources are there, and the support to support the teachers and the schools making the decisions around allocating the resources are available to them. Planning is a normal part of school life. Schools must ensure that every child receives an appropriate education, and it would, I suppose, be ridiculous if you think about the amount of resources that have gone into schools since 2011 if there wasn't planning in place in the school to ensure that the best possible allocation was not done in terms of those resources and the best possible, I suppose, service given to those, education given to the children who are most in need. So I think planning is essential, and it's also good professional practice. Provision, and this issue has been raised by one of my colleagues here, the issue about planning time. Well, all of the circulars of the department in terms of giving the additional resources to schools, there is provision there for additional planning time, but schools have to make a judgment about what is appropriate to their needs. Clearly, the amount of time that you would need in one school will be very different, will vary from school to school, and you'll have to take account, and the people on the ground are in the best position to decide what amount of coordination time is required. The department, NEPS, the NCSE provide a range of supports, guidance and professional developments for teachers and schools. I should also say that the department's inspectorate, who are in schools up and down the country on a regular basis, their view about what's happening in schools, that planning is taking place, that the resources are being well used. And I think while we need to continually tweak the guidance that we're giving, the professional development that we're doing, and to enhance that, I think we're on an upward trajectory in terms of what it is we want to do in terms of special needs. And reference has been made to therapeutic supports, and I think the department is actually taken on a very innovative kind of direction in this regard. With the reference has been made to a project that's underway in one of the areas around Kildare and Wicklow, where there are in-school therapies being used and being used to good advantage and for a better outcome for children. In terms of the July provision, I think we take on board the point that was made and made around by people around the table. The NCSE flagged this as an issue, that there was an issue of equity, that currently it's confined to two categories of special need: those children with severe, profound intellectual disabilities and students with autism spectrum disorder. And we have a group that's looking at it. Some over 9,000 students avail of it each year. I think our view would be that you would try to broaden that and make it more equitable. I suppose somebody summed it up very neatly around the table about who actually should avail of it and what should the content of it be and how would it be rolled out. I think those are very good questions that our group has to consider. And when we develop proposals on this, which we expect to do in coming months, we will consult people about it. There won't be any changes for this year, but I think we can safely say that we will move, and there will be some change over the next 12 months.
Okay, thank you, Eddie. Clarification, yes, Deputy Martin.
You mentioned, that planning is essential, and it's good professional practice. As almost, I would take it, as someone who comes from the teaching profession, as nearly a slight on teachers who are not getting the time needed to do that professional planning. That's part of the frustration with parents and with teachers, that they don't have the time to do the planning that's needed to give these children the proper education, the thorough education that they deserve. And you referenced the many resources to 2011. I wonder if we reflected over the last 8 years, how many initiatives have been brought into schools since 2011, because I think it's initiative overload. I'm only out of the teaching profession for 3 years now since I got elected here, and you mentioned the circulars. I had reached circular overload by 2016, and I was 20 years practicing, but it seemed to be very much in that last, since 2011, and that's because teachers were reaching initiative overload and circular overload because the resources weren't being put in place. So then what happens is teachers are being told to do this. They're being told of the drive-bys and the inspections and inspection after inspection, and they know that it's just a case of let's fill out this sheet, let's fill out this form, but they can't give the child the proper education that they deserve, that they should experience that proper education experience, because they don't have the resources. They need that non-contact time, they need the funding, and essentially they need the training. And just speaking again on, I worked in a DEIS school with many fantastic children that enriched my teaching experience because of the vast array of special educational needs they had, and that's why I loved where I was teaching. But it's simply frustrating. I always felt that we received some level of CPD or some level of someone coming in an afternoon when a specific need had presented itself in a school, rather than putting the training in place, as Fidelma has suggested at the very beginning. Teachers don't need to be trained when a situation presents itself. They need to be armed with all the training, so when it presents themselves, they're ready to hit the ground running. And that's what every teacher in primary and secondary school wants to do, and that's what every parent of children with special education needs, or parents with children who do not have special education needs. But in order for a child to get that fundamental human right that they have to a proper inclusive education, to a proper thorough education, the teachers must be resourced, they must get the non-contact time, and they must essentially be trained properly. And I know this is not you, Eddie, but the Minister must prioritise this. They must prioritise our children with special educational needs, and that means not this passing the buck on, it's down to the school to allocate the resources when they come in and present themselves. We've had enough of that in our schools. It's not working, and I would ask you to maybe, and I will do it as well, but I'd ask you maybe from this meeting to maybe pass the buck on to the Minister and put the proper resources in place. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy. I'm going to go on now to Deputy O'Sullivan.
Thanks, Chair, and thank you all very much. I think actually the round of answers has sort of clarified in the sense of what page we should all be on, and I think, sort of shown that actually, despite it seemed like there were differences, that I think actually what we're all agreed on is that we need to put in the resources and the planning and the teachers, etc., teacher time, in order to achieve the rights of children with variety of disabilities, including Down syndrome in our schools. And I think Fidelma, in placing it in the ratification of the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, also the EBSN Act, obviously, but as has been said, elements of that are still not implemented. But I think the fact that the Convention has been ratified now does place it in very much in a rights-based situation. And therefore, I think from the committee's perspective, in terms of doing a report, we do need to be focusing on how do we actually put in place the resources, the time, etc., that's required in order for children to vindicate that right. So I do think it's about funding, it's about teacher time, it's about training, both initial teacher training and also initial teacher education, and also CPD for teachers in the system. So I suppose most of my questions then would be to Eddie in terms of whether, or anybody else who may have quantified, or anybody who has information on quantifying, what those resources are. What kind of, I know it's been said that some of the planning happens, obviously it happens in the schools, but I agree with other members who say that for teachers to do that, they do need the time to do that planning. So just, I think in terms of, is there any assessment on the actual resources that would be required in terms of extra planning hours for teachers, in terms of training hours, in terms of the funding for all of this, because I think that will be required if we're going to actually implement it properly. And obviously, I know that it's correct to say that quite a lot of resources have been put into special education since 2011. But I think we are in a new place now in the sense that we have the new model in, we have the UN Convention ratified, and we also have a recovering economy, so we should be able to put the necessary resources in. I also want to ask a bit more about July provision, because I suppose it hasn't got as much attention as the individual education plan, and I think it's actually really important for young people to have the opportunity to access July provision where it would be helpful to them. And it is very restricted at the moment. And Eddie, you've told us that, that there is a review happening. I think what you've said is that the coming months is the sort of time frame. Just if you could give us some idea of when you expect recommendations to come forward. And, the benefit of July provision is very much evident, I think, from anybody who accesses it, because it does actually give that continuity through the summer months that is particularly needed, I think, for children who have learning difficulties of one kind or another. So I would like to see progress on that as well. And again, whether there has been any assessment on the kind of resources that would be needed in terms of funding, training and teachers. I think there's generally, or there used to be, there's a list of people who do July provision, if that's the case, or if is there a teacher shortage issue in terms of July provision. But certainly I think maybe it's not a scheme that an awful lot of people actually know about, but it is extremely beneficial to a lot of individual children in our schools. So I wouldn't like to think that we'd kind of, put very little focus on July provision today, because I do think it's an important scheme. Thanks. Thank you,
Deputy. Senator Gavin.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks to all the speakers for attending today, and I think there's an awful lot of very valuable information from everybody, so thank you for that. Just to begin, I just want to reference what Eddie said in his statement very early on. He said, government policy on supporting children with special educational needs aims to ensure that all children with special needs, including children with Down syndrome, can have access to an education appropriate to their needs. And I suppose my first question is, how do you reconcile that statement with what we've heard today? Because clearly there are significant gaps in the system, 15 years after the Epsom Act come into being. And I really struggle to see how you can reconcile the statement, no matter how well-intentioned, with the reality of what we've heard here. I have a couple more questions just in relation to information we've got. There does seem to be a consistent message from everybody that there are real issues in terms of training. And a couple of key points were made. The barriers to continuous professional development. Maybe, Colin, if you get an opportunity just to expand on that, please, for us, it would be very helpful. And I know that Moira spoke about, and it sounds absolutely right, that we should have a continuum of support model in place for training. So I do again want to ask Eddie in relation to that, what plans does the department have to address the training deficit? Because it's quite clear that there is a training deficit. And if we're really going to resolve this issue, then we have to look at that. Two other quick questions to finish, Chair, if I may. The first is, and I suppose I'm just asking this question, it comes from Fidelma's presentation, where she mentions the fact that schools are encouraged to, rather than obligated to, provide an individual educational plan. It just strikes me that's not good enough as a model. If we're really serious about implementing rights, surely encouraging isn't enough. That doesn't mean we don't have to address the key resource issues that are absolutely validly made by all of the teachers' unions today, but it just strikes me that if we're going to implement a rights-based programme truly, then it's not enough to encourage schools. There needs to be a level of obligation there. And then finally, I know it's been mentioned a couple of times, but just in relation to the July provision, a couple of simple questions here. When did that review begin? And whenever you begin a review, you have an end date of a review. Any work I've ever done, you have a start date and an end date. I'd like to know what the end date is. You should be able to tell us that now, please. And like everyone here, I suspect, I just want to know when that very valuable July provision is going to be expanded Because there is a fear, I think, if you don't mind me suggesting, because I met some people from Down syndrome last week, that this review is going to take too long and not provide the very real and necessary additional supports quickly. And for the life of me, given that I think we can all recognise that there's a problem here that needs to be delivered, I can't understand why it would take so long. So maybe if you could tell us when the review has begun and what the finish date for the review is, please, because surely you'd have that date already in place, so that at least people going away here today will have a very clear idea of when we can expect recommendations and action. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Dolan.
Margaret Cahirlock. First of all, I'd like to thank the representative from Down Syndrome Ireland, the 3 unions and the Department of Education, and equally and as much my colleagues for their engagement and their serious engagement in this issue. It took until just before 4:30 before there was the first mention of the UN Convention. We'd gone the whole way around, I think I'm correct in that, and we were back in supplementaries. I want to come to the Convention. Article 24, and there's no beating around the bush, it just says education. And it starts off by saying states parties, and now we can take out the word states parties because Ireland has ratified. And what we can put in there instead is say Ireland recognises the right of persons with disabilities to education, with a view to realising this right without discrimination and on the basis of equal opportunity. Ireland shall ensure an inclusive education system at all levels and lifelong learning directed to the full development of human potential, dignity, self-worth, etc. The development by persons with disabilities of their personality, talents, creativity, as well as their mental and physical abilities, etc. Enabling persons with disabilities to participate effectively in a free society. And then it goes on, and I won't read the whole thing. In realising this right, Ireland shall ensure, I'm putting in the word Ireland where the Convention said states parties, because we have ratified it, and we need to remind ourselves of that. Persons with disabilities are not excluded from the general education system on the basis of their disability, and that children with disabilities are not excluded from free and compulsory primary education or from secondary education on the basis of disability. Reasonable accommodation of the person's requirements. Persons with disabilities receive the support required within the general education system to facilitate their effective education. Effective individualised support measures are provided in environments that maximise academic and social development consistent with the goal of full inclusion. I have laboured that a little bit. I think it's quite interesting that the Department of Education could participate in this without a mention of the fact that a year ago this week, the Dáil passed a motion unanimously to ratify the Convention. And 13 months from now, in April of next year, Ireland and each department as part of that will be making its first report on implementation. What has changed? So I think we need to be very clear that there are standards that we took 11 years to get to, saying we will have, right? And that brings us to, what was the term there? Encourage and not obliged. This is given the lie, absolutely, to the idea that our standard would be that we would encourage. Our standard is that we are obliged. Now, maybe there are steps to the stairs, of course there are, and that's allowed for, but we have to go beyond encouragement. Teachers encourage children to do things, but Ireland says it's doing it, it's on the road to it. Trying to put my head in the space of the parent of a child with a disability, Down syndrome or whatever. I'm finding this in sporting parlance, and I'm coming to a question now, as being like a nil-all draw. The department has a position. The teachers have a position. And I see this in health and environment. Environment won't provide the house that's accessible until the HSE tells them that they have all the personal supports ready. The HSE won't provide all the personal supports the person needs until environment tell them that the house is ready. Perfect, nil all. Everyone is committed, but no one has actually moved. Now, I think Maura Layden said there might be some practical things that need to be done. I'm saying to the two key parties in this, the department and the trade unions, what are those practical things? And they need to be started to be talked about now. So, if you like, that's my core question. What gets us going out of this room without everybody having been happy, the two parties having been happy that they have held up their side? We need to move it. Now, the movement may not be ideal in the short term or in the interim, but something has to give sooner rather than later. Because right now, it's the kids and their families that are continuing to lose out. And here's a sort of a provocative question. And I'm not putting this to you, Colin, in the sense, but you talked about teachers being professionals. That's a given. Are the trade unions being professional at this stage? In this sense, it sounds to me like it's the same approach, which is the last in, the first out, if you want to put it. The supports to people with disabilities are a relatively recent thing. So we're going to say, all right, we can't deal with this until. Why can't something else begin to give a bit in the system? Why does it have to be the last people in? 30 years ago, the department was arguing in the courts that there were certain person, and I can't pronounce the word, ineducable. The O'Donoghue case, the Synod case, and that was going on in this country. We've moved from that. And from the department's point of view, the getting to essential rather than mandated, rather than it would be nice if it could be done. The department is under the cosh of what the houses of the Oireachtas have agreed to. And I don't get a sense a year later that there has been any urgency put into that. I will say this, and it might seem some way stinging, but for people with disabilities to hear the litany, and we hear it in health and everywhere else all the time, how much money we're putting into disability, that can sound as if you need to be grateful. I don't think it's meant that way. But people need to see the services improving. And so the same question, if you like, to the department. What kind of things, or how are you going to start doing something to shift the thing, to give it that little impetus, to move it on, to give people hope, to start it moving? But right now it seems to me that we're kind of like, dare I say, we're smug. We're doing this. The other side are saying they're doing that. But it's not actually going any place for people. Or it doesn't seem. So that's my, I suppose maybe it's a plea as much as a question. And I round up with this. I think the Minister does need to visit this committee sooner rather than later, because, as has been said already, and you've said it, Cathaoirleach, the unlocking of the EPSAN Act, and it is a decade and a half. The Disability Act the previous year, following year, still loads of it locked up. So these things need to shift, and it is at a political level. And I'd make that request to the committee for your own consideration.
Thank you, Senator, and I think you absolutely put your finger on the pulse for all of us and everything that you've said. I'll just make a few comments before I go back to the committee, or to the stakeholders. This is something that I feel very deeply and passionately about. I've both personal and professional experience in the area. I have a much-loved brother with Down syndrome. I was a primary school teacher, and I will always remember a situation before anyone had ever heard of July provision, individual education plans, or indeed SNAs. I remember having a little girl with Down syndrome in second class, along with 35 others, I may add, and with no resources and no supports. And I honestly believed at that time that I failed that child, and I still believe that I failed that child, and I still think about it in terms of everything that she needed and she deserved and didn't have. And you could well ask, why was it a situation that she arrived to second class without those supports, but in fact she had been in a special school up to that point in time, and then her parents decided that they would like to have her in a mainstream school because her twin brother was in a mainstream school, and we can all absolutely understand that she didn't want to feel different from her brother. And one of the things that I always remember then too is the bus coming from where she had been in a special school to bring her back for the Christmas party, and she didn't want to go. She didn't necessarily want to stay either, but she was completely caught between the two education worlds. And it is something that I think about on an ongoing basis. It was many, many years ago. And then I worked with Special Olympics as well, so with athletes with intellectual disability, and many of them being Down syndrome. And I suppose that is the type of experience that informs me in relation to the whole area of special education and needs. And indeed, I'm on the Oireachtas Disability Committee, which Senator Dolan chairs extremely well. And any time we have the opportunity to look at different areas, we do. And today we're looking at education for Down syndrome, but bearing in mind that obviously a lot of what we're talking about is for the benefit of all students with intellectual disability, and particularly around the July provision and the individual education plans. And so there are some specific questions that I would like to put, but I think it would be remiss of me. I think while we, as a committee, and I think it has, members have put it very, very eloquently, where we are, as a society, failing the children. When I look back to when my brother was born, and when I look back even when I was teaching that particular child, and I look back to even 10 or 15 years ago, I think we have come a long way, and we absolutely do have to acknowledge that. But it's about continuing to improve and continuing to ensure that all of our children with Down syndrome and our children with intellectual disability have the chance to shine, because it is within all of them to shine. And we absolutely, as educators and us as legislators, need to ensure that we put everything in place to make sure that that happens, and to make sure that the teachers have a positive educational experience teaching the children with Down syndrome. But the very specific questions that I want to put, in terms of, and I accept that there is a review going on at the moment around July provision, and the question has been asked about, the timelines, which I hope, Eddie, you will be able to give us. But, I'm just wondering, what rationale was ever put in place to say that children with Down syndrome should not or could not avail of July provision? It just, to me, makes no sense that at one point a decision was made that they would not be able to avail of such. In terms of the individualised educational plans, to be perfectly honest, I think every child within our system should have a type of individual education plan. Specifically what resources are needed, because I do agree with comments that have been made that at the end of the day there has to be planning in every school, and there has to be planning in every classroom, and to a certain extent there needs to be a level of planning for every single child, because how else does a teacher relate to a child's progress or lack of progress at a student, at a teacher-parent meeting? So there has to be some type of plan that is in place in terms of assessing and supporting a child and their progress. So I cannot understand why a plan cannot be put in place for children with Down syndrome. And like my colleague, Deputy Funchion, I cannot understand how teachers' unions would stand over the fact that there wouldn't be, or more or less recommending to teachers that shouldn't happen. I also agree completely with my colleague Deputy Martin around the whole terminology, that a plan such as this is recommended but not mandatory. Except, the fact that so many circulars come out. It was 86 circulars last year that came out to teachers. But I think that we absolutely have to try and close the circle here. And we need to look at the resources that the teachers need. We need to look at the training that teachers need to ensure that these plans are put in place. And in terms of the training that teachers need, I know that, Eddie, you have outlined some of the courses that are available, but just wondering really when the teachers are able to avail of those. For example, if they can do it during working hours, and if so, are they eligible for substitute cover? Because that's something that we've come across here as a committee, that there are recommendations made around training for teachers, but no substitute cover is supplied, and that's absolutely wrong. I accept at the moment it is difficult to get substitutes, and that's a whole other issue that we have examined in detail, but I think in principle substitute cover absolutely has to be provided for teachers in order to support them and give them the absolute resources. In terms of the EPSN Act and why that has not been fully commenced, and we know that the Minister has replied to several parliamentary questions to say that it won't be for quite a period of time, but has a cost been put on the necessary measures that need to be put in place and implemented? Because if so, I think we need to know what that is, and we need to have an engagement with the Minister around that, because it's very clear that 15 years, as Senator Dolan said, since that Act was passed, it's more than regrettable. It's completely wrong that it is not in place. And just finally, excuse me, just to ask again going back to the TUI and ASTI, if you're saying that an individual education programme, a plan, wouldn't be in place, what alternative do you see being put in place for those children? Because generally speaking, a child with Down syndrome or with intellectual disability will not be able to follow the full curriculum within a classroom, and there has to be extra thought put into the type of curriculum that in some subjects, not in all, that a child with Down syndrome or intellectual disability would be able to follow. So some planning has to go in place to making sure that child has the opportunity to fulfil their potential. So there has to be some thought in relation to it. So anyway, that's just what I want to put forward. So I'm going to go back now. Maeve, you've indicated first.
In response to Deputy O'Sullivan and Senator Dolan, I just want to respond around the possibility and what type of resources, the teachers need. I just want to give an example of this weekend. The INTO held its special education conference in Cork on Saturday, and it was over 300 teachers were in attendance, and we had one workshop in particular on planning and special education, trying to respond to the needs of our members who are looking for support in planning and special education. It was probably the one workshop where we needed security on the door to control the stampede towards the workshop. Such is the appetite amongst teachers on a Saturday afternoon for CPD in the area. So I think we should be very clear. Teachers are very dedicated to this. There is just one, we've heard a lot about planning and planning. We really don't want to lose focus either on high quality teaching, and that is essential. Planning, by all means, is critical. It's a central part of teaching and learning. Teachers do plan conscientiously, or very conscientiously, but at the same time, we don't want our teachers to become administrators. They're already floored with paperwork, bureaucracy, and I think where the real focus should be on high-quality teaching to support the children with Down syndrome. Just on that.
No, that's a fair point, yeah. Colin.
Thanks, Chair. I suppose in addressing a couple of questions your own Chair and Senator Dolan's and Senator Gavin's, and to go back, I neglected to answer a question that Senator Byrne put to me earlier on. If we can do that in the context of explaining a bit of my own personal background. My wife is an SEN coordinator. She's a teacher in a greenfield site in Dublin, and she would, as a matter of course in her role, engage in individual planning for students. I'm being very careful about how I say this, because the individual planning that she engages in for her students is not consistent with the individual education plans that are set out in the EPSN Act. And yet she does it, and her colleagues do it, and our members in schools all over the country plan for individual students. We in the TUI also represent members delivering in youth reach centres. In the youth reach centres around the country, 20 of the centres receive supplementary funding from the Special Education Needs Initiative to implement individual learning plans, ILPs. And we're really used to acronyms in the TUI. I mean, the TUI is an acronym. But the individual learning plans track students' progress and set out a plan of education for students through second chance education. And our members engage in that and are resourced in that in 20 of the youth reach centres. Our members don't engage in it in the other youth reach centres because they're not resourced. But the resourcing provides for the staffing in order to do that. Just moving back to the individual education plans that are set out in the EPSN Act. They are, as people have noted, 15 years old. The concept of the IEP as designed in the EPSN Act is 15 years old. Educational theory, educational philosophy and educational practices come a long way since EPSN was written. And to move back to Senator Byrne's question, what would we suggest instead? Right now we don't know, but our members are already working on it. Our members are in schools tracking students, they're supporting students, they're coming up with innovative ways of differentiating for those students. And they have a wealth of knowledge that we could offer to the National Council for Special Education. Now, it's to our regret that the Minister did not see fit to put any of our representatives onto the NCSE in the last round of invitations for interest in seats on the SE and the NCSE. But nonetheless, we are available to the Department, to the NCSE and to other stakeholders to discuss alternatives to EPSN that would be more forward-thinking than simply implementing a 15-year-old Act. To go back to the question that Senator Gavin asked around CPD, my wife's experience and what she utilises in terms of planning for these students, and teachers are, by their nature, lifelong learners, so she has amended her practice over the last 5 years as she has continued to learn as a teacher. But she has a basis on which to build, and the basis on which she builds is a postgraduate diploma in special education that she received from the Church of Ireland College of Education, what is now in DCU. And my colleague from the ASTI mentioned these are level 9 courses, they are postgraduate diplomas, they are intense courses. Myself and Deputy Funchion did a level 9 together in employment law a number of years ago, and it took up a vast amount of our time that year. They are intense in terms of time, and they are also intense in terms of cost. And bear in mind that to become a teacher now, after completing your free education and getting your undergraduate degree, you now have to engage in a 2-year postgraduate diploma in education, which is costing our members in excess of 10 grand, and 2 years of their lives. Following that, when they start teaching, in order to undertake this postgraduate diploma in special education, again, it's another added cost of at least €5,000 per year, and a cost in terms of their time, at a time in their lives when they're trying to save for houses, trying to settle down and start families. So something needs to be done to address the availability of that training, the funding of that training, and the time made available. And then at the point at which my wife received that particular allowance some 10 years ago, there was a financial benefit to her, which was recognised by the Department of Education and Skills in their business case to DEEPR in 2012 as a qualification allowance, which is fundamentally a misnomer of what that allowance was for, the special educational needs allowance. While it was only available to persons that had undertaken the qualification in special educational needs, there was a requirement on the person to retain the allowance, to be engaged in the delivery of education to students with special educational needs directly within their school for a minimum of 5 years, and to participate in the planning of the delivery of that education. So it was a complete misnomer on the part of the department and DEEPR to see that as solely a qualification allowance. That allowance was available to people to do the kind of work that we're talking about today, and was withdrawn in 2012. And that's something that the department and this committee needs to give serious consideration to.
Okay, thank you, Colin.
Thanks, Chair.
Enlightening. Moira.
Thank you. I can add anything further to that. I think I think Maeve's point about we really shouldn't lose focus of quality teaching, and this is what precipitated this angst and this movement of concern, was the fact would teachers now be required to engage in a bureaucratic compliance type of, as Colin mentioned earlier on, medicalised type of assessment of pupils, instead of engaging in what they're best at, which is the classroom teaching, where they are instinctively and professionally doing the differentiation and doing their plans. I mean, teachers have to have termly plans and have to have annual plans for each class group and each year. So, I mean, planning is being done, but I think it is the expectation of the model of planning that is now seemingly being required of schools is what has precipitated these concerns. And I have to say that's what trade unions do. We have to listen to our members' concerns, and we have to be able to say, yes, we are going to seek to advance them. And that was giving the advice was the first step. What's the next step? I think this has been a really productive meeting. I think, we've all listened to each other. I think the worst case scenario, Senator Dolan, is this nil-nil, because you know what, that's a cop-out on both sides. I think we now need to work together. The ASTI has written to the Department of Education seeking a meeting to look at the issues we want addressed, the coordination time, the planning time, the allowance, which is a really significant issue, and also the whole area of a revised planning model. So yes, we are seeking to advance it, but I think we are now coming into the last tranche of the school year, so to speak. I think it behoves all of us in the system. I'm sure Eddie will take this back to his colleagues. We need to get this sorted out this year. We cannot be in the business of going back into schools in September. Sorry, I'm talking about school year. Yeah, we can't be in the business of going back into school in September with this simmering nil-nil status still there. That's really not acceptable, I think.
Thank you, Moira. Fidelma?
I suppose I would just like to say, Maeve, I agree with you on your statement that we don't want to lose sight of the fact that we need high quality teaching. But I suppose, as somebody that has been a teacher for many, many years, I can't teach without planning. Planning informs my teaching. Planning informs me on a day-to-day basis what it is that I have to do. And I suppose I would agree with what everybody is saying here today. I love your nil-nil imagery there. I think that's excellent, and of course it would be regrettable if we leave here today without kind of feeling that we have moved forward in any shape or form. I agree with you. I'm sorry, I forget who said it, that the Minister really needs to be here to meet with this and to discuss this with this committee. But I suppose what we really feel within Down Syndrome Ireland, I suppose, if I may, just to make this little comparison, allowing a student to struggle academically or socially when all that is needed for success are appropriate accommodation and explicit instruction is no different than failing to provide a ramp for a person with a wheelchair. And that would be where we would feel very strongly about this. We do take very, very seriously the issues our parents raise, etc., etc. And like it was most, I suppose, the thing that angered us to a degree was, I suppose, there's 2 points. Before Christmas, when the two directives, I'm aware now there were advice, but at the time and in the public media and in the public domain, they were identified as directives issued by the teacher unions. They were something that we were very distressed about. And I suppose, again, somebody has mentioned this already, but to see in a reply, in a parliamentary reply to a parliamentary question that, on the one hand, circulars note that educational planning is an essential element of a whole school approach to meeting pupils' needs. And then 2 lines further down, all schools are therefore encouraged to use education plans. So where is the tie between essential and encouraged? We shouldn't have to encourage anybody to do something that's essential. But to ensure that the essential needs are met, I'm going to go back again. We need training, we need resources, we need time. And I would hope that, from this meeting on will be an impetus and a starting point for moving forward with this as we all work together. Again, just to agree with Colm, I do think it's regrettable, like I too, Colm, was not invited to sit on the NCSE this year on their latest appointment, so it must be you and I both, Colm. So, and the ASTI, so we're all in the same boat. But it does beg the question as to who is advising, when the people on the ground that are working in the areas of special needs, like who is the advisors that were appointed? And that's not sour grapes. That's just, it's a question I would always ask. These consultations, who are being consulted? We've questions on that, and I could be here all night. So, thank you.
Obviously, we're not being critical of people who were appointed.
Obviously not.
So just to make that very clear.
Yeah, obviously
and
not.
Also, just very genuinely to acknowledge the excellent work that teachers do in this area.
Absolutely.
And I get to witness it on an ongoing basis. And really, the compassion and the understanding and the commitment of teachers that we have in our schools to those with special needs is really absolutely excellent. Eddie, I'm going to give the final word to you.
Thank you, Chair. At the outset, I have to acknowledge, that this outing has been very informative and very helpful. I was particularly interested in Senator Dolan's input. I thought it was kind of inspirational. Sometimes people think that, because we're in policy making or whatever, that we're insulated from the realities of life, but we all have our own story around these things. And I think, your input was informative. I'm only new to this brief. I visited a number of schools since I've taken over the brief, and I have to say what I've seen is actually very dedicated people doing a job, and the air of calmness in schools, that are dealing with special needs. I was just totally convinced that, these children were in the best place possible and good things were happening here. And I do believe that it's all about quality teaching and learning. And I suppose, as a department, we have to have a way of ensuring that that is happening, and our inspectors give us positive feedback that, good things are happening in our schools in an objective way. And I suppose that planning is happening. There is a formula in the legislation that goes back a bit, and, Colm said that maybe that formula needs to be looked at. But certainly, I think internationally, practice might have moved on from that particular formula that was enshrined in that particular legislation. The issue of July provision was raised, and just to address it briefly, the review was done by the NCSE a number of years ago, and as part of its autism review, and it said that the July provision scheme was inequitable. There is a working group looking at how we might come up with a scheme that might be more equitable. The NCSE recommendation was that the scheme should be for children with complex needs. It didn't say who those children might be, or what categories. Currently, the scheme is provided for two categories: the severe and profound, and students with autism spectrum disorder. Now, and I think Deputy O'Sullivan asked the question: who delivers it currently? Well, there's a school strand and there's a parent strand. and it costs 14 million. Not that that money should be necessarily a big part of it, but it certainly, I suppose, comes into the math in terms of dividing a pie. But in terms, there is a working group looking at it, and there is, I suppose, what the NCSE were also hinting at in their advice, that the programme might be just broader than just school curriculum kind of stuff, that might be activity based. So in terms of the work that's been done so far, there's been consultation with a number of other departments and state agencies as to about what direction we might be going. I would hope that the group would have recommendations internally, I suppose, in the next number of months. I think we should be able to talk to stakeholders later in the year. I'm talking about maybe, I don't know, September, October, with the view to making sure that we have maybe a revamped programme to offer for July of next year. That's the tentative plan as we have it, but there's been a bit of work done on it in terms of devising a programme. Clearly, you know, there are something short of 200,000 children in receipt, and this is an estimate, in receipt of sports in our schools. And, you know, you have to say, well, how are you going to, you know, what categories, how are you going to prioritise the investment? Are you going to cover everybody? And if we're currently covering 9,500 students, and that's costing 14 million, you can do the sums, you know. So there will be some decisions having to be made here. There will be some, I suppose, priorities having to be struck. And but certainly, I'm anxious to move it on and taking on board what the committee is saying. I think I need to give it, we need to give it that much more urgency, and we will do that. Just to say. Just on the bright side, like, I mean, we started off by talking about how successful inclusion has been. And I know from even, like, I've got children myself and they're now adults, even from the time when they were in primary school and in post-primary school, things have changed inexorably. The numbers of support, the amount of training and development, even if it is still inadequate, it has increased proportionately and hugely. And I suppose the level of commitment and information given to parents and engagement with parents has also improved. Just to say that, as well, the department, I suppose, we're going through a spot of innovation. I suppose this is assisted hugely by the NCSE and the development of the NCSE. And by the way, if anybody wants to know the membership of the NCSE, they're available on their website and their backgrounds. And I can assure you they all have a background and an experience and knowledge of special education and related matters. But in terms of the in-school therapy project, I suppose, that will, I think, in terms of going forward, it will innovate and test a model around in-school therapies, occupational therapies, SLT therapies, and how the agencies collaborate on the ground in working in schools. It's a test, and we'll probably enhance it maybe later on in the year, and there will be further announcements and engagement maybe around that. I think what we're trying to do is to test a model that we can ultimately mainstream, that it will be evidence-based, and that will have the confidence of all the stakeholders, parents, teachers, whoever. And I think that would be I think that's a very positive development, and I think the NCSE and its establishment, I think, have been crucial to this new evidence-based focus in terms of how we make policy and how we I suppose, develop services. The second piece, maybe just to bring to your attention, is that the NCSE is currently looking at, I suppose, the role of special schools and special classes and how that has been taking shape. And that policy review, there's been consultations about it already, and we expect that it will be delivered towards the middle of next year. That will be something, I think, that as policymakers and as practitioners we will be looking at in terms of its impact in the years ahead. But I think it is a good place to be, because at least now we've got the people and the experts to be looking at these kind of developments, looking at what it is we're doing locally and what international trends are and taking account of our local legislation and UN conventions and whatever, to make sure that we are positioned in a good place going forward. So, thanks again to the Chair and the Committee.
Thank you. Thank you, Eddie. Well, look, I think it was a very informative engagement, and I think we had real engagement here today. And we, as a committee, will be discussing further, and we will be issuing a report and recommendations. But I think it's important that we would consider writing directly to the Minister also, both in terms of possibly looking for a meeting in relation to this, along with other policy issues that we feel that it is important to engage on. But I really want to thank all of the stakeholders for giving us your time, your experience and your expertise this afternoon, and I want to thank the members also. As there is no other business, this meeting of the Joint Committee is adjourned until 3:30 p.m. on Tuesday, the 26th of March 2019. Thank you.